if you wanted to find one aspect of life here in Montgomery, and probably many other cities in the South, where people were really troubled about the way they were treated, it would be the buses. Black people had to sit in the back, white people in the front, and when the bus filled up, if there were more white people who didn't have seats, the whole front row of black people would have to give up their seats, even for one white person. Oftentimes, if there were white people on the bus, the drivers would make the black passengers get on the bus at the front, pay their money, get back off the bus, run to the back door, get onto the back door, and sometimes the drivers would drive away before they could get on the back door. Some of the drivers used horrible language and threatened the black passengers. And there were just all kinds of things that happened. Everybody either experienced bad treatment on the buses or knew people who had been treated badly. And there was one horrible episode when a young man who had fought in the Second World War had come back to Montgomery, refused to obey the instructions, or I should say the orders of the driver. A policeman came, dragged him off the bus, and shot and killed him. So everybody was aware of how badly they were being treated on the buses. You have to know about a group called the Women's Political Council. This was a group of women, several hundred women, who had determined that and these were all African American women, they had determined that they wanted to do something to change the lot of black people. And they centered on buses because that was just a universal experience of black people being treated badly on the buses, and decided that they were probably going to have to stage a boycott of the buses to get some change made. They met with city officials and bus company officials and said to them, if you don't give us better treatment, we're going to have to boycott your buses. Then they started looking for an opportunity to organize a boycott, decided that if somebody got arrested, and people were arrested all the time for disobeying the drivers, if somebody got arrested, they would get people stirred up and say, okay, we're going to stay off the buses. Well, there had been some young women who had been arrested, and this is not enough to trigger a boycott. When Mrs. Parks was arrested on December the 1st, 1955, it was different. She was known to everybody in town. She was highly respected and honored and looked upon as one of the finest people in the city of Montgomery. And when she was arrested, the Women's Political Council members said, okay, this is it. We've got to go with it this time. So it was the women who started the boycott. They spread out all over town with little flyers that said, stay off the buses on Monday. Another one of our women has been arrested. And so it was the women who were in the Women's Political Council who actually pulled it off. One of the most difficult questions we had to answer was sort of peripherally related to our spiritual activity, and that is, did we have the right to subject our children to the possible harm that might come to us? Because not only were our lives threatened, but there were people threatening our children's lives on a regular basis. And people would call us up and say, I see your children out in the yard there, and are you sure they're okay out there? And the children would be in the yard, so that we knew that they were people who were looking at what was going on. Or they'd say, I see you got your drapes closed at the picture window in the front of the house. I want you to open the drapes and stand there because I've got a gun. I want to shoot you, this kind of thing. And it was okay for Jeannie and me to put our lives in danger, but did we have the right to put our children through that? And we finally decided that we couldn't control that God had brought us here. The children were in God's hands, and if God wanted them to be protected, that would be His job. The first thing that happened was that Sunday morning I announced to the congregation, I want you all to stay off the buses tomorrow. And by the way, you know that this was first called as a one-day boycott. That's all that was going to happen. And I said, I want you all to stay off the buses. I'll be out in my car all day long. If you need a ride, I'll be glad to come and take you wherever you need to go. So I spent the whole day just driving people around, picking people up on the street, whatever, except for about an hour or less when I went to the court and watched the proceedings when Mrs. Parks was found guilty. And then after that, I was a volunteer driver for many weeks, and was part of the original carpool that they organized, and where this was all volunteer drivers that were hauling people all over the place. I got arrested only one time when I was driving people around, and by the sheriff himself. So I felt privileged to have been arrested by somebody of importance. Well, just before the boycott started, that weekend, a lot of the ministers in town got together to organize what became the Montgomery Improvement Association, and organized the board of the MIA at that time. I was soon after that added to the board of directors and became part of the whole experience of running the day-to-day activities of the bus boycott. They were sending me around the country to raise money. You know, it was a novel thought to have a white person speaking on behalf of the 50,000 black people in Montgomery, so that I was part of that experience. I was able to meet with both white people and black people and get groups together across racial lines. I joined both the Black Ministerial Alliance and the White Ministerial Association and helped to organize an illegal interracial ministers group that met all over the state and tried to bring about at least some kind of contact across racial lines, so that at least there were some bridges built that were important later on. There's a group here called the Montgomery Council on Human Relations. There's a state council, and each of the southern states had a state council on human relations. And I went to a meeting of the local council that was held at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Dr. King, as the host, was there, and I got to meet him and just briefly talked with him. But I decided that anybody who sounded as smart as he was and was articulate as he was and had the name Martin Luther, I had to get to know him better. And after the boycott started, I certainly did. I worked with him very closely. I have never known anybody who had such a high level of wisdom and understanding, and he was the kind of person who could read a book and then begin to recite back to you what were the main thoughts of a book. He knew the teachings of philosophers whose names I couldn't even spell, so he was just head and shoulders above all of us in terms of his intellectual ability and his speaking ability and his understanding of what was going on and what was happening in the human heart. This movement was truly a spiritual movement, and the very fact that these women who were part of the Women's Political Council were all members of churches here in town. The original board of the Montgomery Improvement Association was mostly Christian ministers and lay people from the churches. So it was the church in action. And the interesting thing about the way that functioned was that, in effect, the church in the black community was reinterpreting what the Bible said about how human beings ought to treat one another. And they realized that the words of Jesus didn't comply at all with the realities that they faced in everyday life. So that it was the black Christians teaching white Christians what it meant to be Christian. And it was a deeply spiritual movement, and Dr. King added to that and sort of set the tone for that in all of his speaking and his ministry here. The mass meetings, which were held twice a week for the first few weeks and then once a week for the next year, these mass meetings were all worship services. People would arrive early. Sometimes people would get off work and just go straight to the church where the mass meeting was going to be held and sit there and sing and pray. And then the leaders would come in when it was time for the meeting to start. And the speeches were sermons. And there was a lot more praying. And we took up offerings these mass meetings. So that these were really church experiences that we were having here. From the very beginning of the boycott on December the 5th, as people got out and walked to work or shared rides and everything, from the very beginning, everyone knew that something big was happening. And then when 5,000 people gathered the evening of December the 5th at Holt Street Baptist Church, and we had that huge mass meeting there, the feeling among the people across the community was that we were doing something that was changing the world. We knew that this would not be stopped. You have to recognize that in the white community in the South in those days, there was a a significant but small minority of white people who were seriously trying to bring about better human relations and really worked at it. And some of them paid the price. Clifford and Virginia Durr, for example, a wonderful couple. He was an attorney. He was in the Roosevelt administration in Washington, D.C., came back to Montgomery to practice law here. When it was known that they were supportive of what was going on, his law practice dwindled down to almost zero. He paid a price for it. There were other white people who paid a price for their support that they were giving us. A number of white ministers spoke out, and particularly among the Methodists here, there were a number of Methodist ministers who were fired from their churches just because they refused to be quiet about things here. So that there was this small minority. There was a much larger minority of people who were the Ku Klux Klan type. The vast majority of white people enjoyed the fruits of the system of segregation and discrimination, but they were, and realized that this was bad, but they were not going to try to change it because they didn't want to upset the apple cart, or, they didn't want to get involved. So that whatever was going to be the situation, the vast majority of the people were going to just go along with whatever was. There was never any question but what we were doing, what we were supposed to be doing. We were here because God brought us here, and in a very real sense, this changed the character of the movement here because it was not totally black then from that point on. And there were many people in the white community who were more angry about that than anything else because we were traitors to the white race, and therefore we had to be dealt with. And as a matter of fact, when the grand jury met and indicted almost 100 leaders of the movement, they made sure not to indict me so that the people who were arrested were all black, and it was obviously not a white and black group. They wanted to make sure that the appearance was correct. But I'm convinced that because of the spirit of the movement, being a spiritual movement, being a movement that was based on love and nonviolence and peaceful protest, that because the movement was what it was, this had made an impact on the hearts of white people across the line, so that later on, when other things began to change in the community, it was more possible for these things to happen because the groundwork had been laid through that bus boycott. This movement began as a spiritual movement within the Christian community of Montgomery. It was not long before it spread beyond the Christian community. Here in Montgomery, the rabbis and some of the leading Jewish families were very supportive of what we were doing. Oftentimes it had to be support behind the scenes because they would have been persecuted well beyond what other people might have been. But across the country, if it had not been for the support of Jewish groups and other faith groups, this movement might have faltered somewhere along the line. It became a cross current of the whole spiritual life of this country. And we really needed every bit of that support. I was in Chicago at that time representing the Ohio Council of Churches at a Methodist gathering where Dr. King was one of the major speakers. And as we were visiting there together, he said, "Are you going to be in Washington for the March on Washington?" And I said, "No, I've got to be here at this meeting." He said, "If there's any way you can get over there, you really must come." And I called somebody and borrowed some money and flew to Washington for the March on Washington, flew back to Chicago, and I have been eternally grateful that I was there. There was an aura about that crowd that was there. It was black and white and yellow and red, and people were obviously labor people, and they were church people, and they were people from all walks of life. It was as if the whole country had said, "Okay, we're going to change things now. We're not going to live the way we've lived before." And it was, just raised the spirits of all the people who were there, and I think all the people across the country. But unfortunately, it wasn't long after that before those 4 children were killed in Birmingham. The whole idea of a beloved community was a relationship among people which would recognize the differences among people, different faith groups, different ethnicities, different languages, different countries, different backgrounds, different economic levels, different sexual orientations, whatever the differences might be, that we would see those differences in one another, recognize them, and applaud them, and reach out to one another and say, we are together, even though we look at our differences and we don't try to claim that they're not there. We are all different, but we are still all together in this one relationship. And the key to that kind of a relationship was respect, which means I look at you and I say, I know that you have value. God put value in you. You look at me and you say the same thing. No matter what differences we have between us, we've got that which draws us together. I was raised up as a Christian, went to the seminary in Columbus, Ohio, and there was taught all the things that were wrong with the Methodists and the Baptists and the Catholics, and because we Lutherans had the pure religion, we had everything straight, and so I grew up thinking that was true. The way we interpreted the Bible, that was the correct way. As I began to work with other faith groups, I began to realize that there were different ways of understanding God's relationship with us, and that we didn't have all the truth, and that I had to open myself up to understand that other people had something to add to the whole mix, that spirituality is a lot more than Lutheranism. The other thing that was a part of the very core of our being is that as time went on, we realized more and more that God has been in charge of our lives, and that as each time passes, that there are ways that God says to us, okay, this is what you're supposed to be doing now, and this is what you're supposed to be doing now. And we realize this presence and this leading, and we have just been overwhelmed by that realization of how God has directed us. One of the things that I learned early on is that there are times when there's nothing that I can do more than simply being with people. I can remember times when I would hurry to get somebody out of jail or something like that, but those opportunities were not all that frequent. And there were times when I knew that somebody was going through something terrible, but I couldn't do anything about it, but at least I could be with them through the experience. And I frankly think that's a major role that every minister should play, to be with his or her people at those extreme times. Everybody thinks about "We Shall Overcome" and some of those songs of the movement, but the interesting thing was that at these mass meetings, those were sung more rarely than the old Christian hymns. And people would gather together and sing one after another these old hymns, and oftentimes never bothering to get the hymnals out of the rack. They knew the hymns. And the interesting thing about that is that these hymns took on new meaning. These old Negro spirituals, which had some deep meanings in the hearts of people in terms of their relationship with their white oppressors, and "Steal Away," and other spirituals which dealt with God's going to take care of me someday. Not now, but God's going to take care of me someday. And in the movement here, these hymns oftentimes took on new significance because of how they related to how people related to one another in the movement. There were scriptures that took on new meaning too, and Bible verses which we would think of, oh, that's a nice thought, became deeply moving to us because of what we were going through here. There was one Bible passage that I have to tell you about. On the last at the last mass meeting before we got back on the buses, people were just in a state of euphoria. Everybody was just wild with excitement. And Reverend Abernathy said to me, "I want you to read the scripture tonight. I want you to read 1 Corinthians chapter 13, the love chapter." And anyhow, Ab said to the congregation, "Our scripture is going to be read tonight by Pastor Bob Graetz." And as I stood up to read, loud applause, this gathering of, I don't know, a couple of thousand people maybe, just thunderous applause. And a reporter turned to Reverend Abernathy and said, "Isn't that a little peculiar, applauding the scripture?" Ab said, "We are a peculiar people." And I got up and started reading. And in the middle of the reading, again, loud applause. And I thought, they're not letting me finish. And I looked down at what I was reading and realized that what I had just read was, when I became a man, I put away childish things. And the people knew that we had matured in this process. We were different people.